Would you judge someone without knowing their story? She did, and paid the emotional price the next day. The steady hum of the airplane filled the cabin as passengers settled into their seats. It was a late afternoon flight from Dallas to Phoenix, a short trip that most of them anticipated would pass without incident. Among them was a tall man in uniform, his neatly pressed fatigues unmistakable. He moved with purpose, his presence commanding a quiet respect, though he seemed to prefer blending into the background. He nodded politely to the flight attendants and quietly took his seat near the middle of the plane. A few rows ahead sat a woman in her early 50s, dressed in a tailored blazer and carrying an aura of self-importance. She adjusted her handbag on her lap, glancing around as if assessing who might dare to disturb her peace. Her eyes landed on the soldier as he stowed his duffel bag in the overhead compartment. Something in her expression shifted, an almost imperceptible sneer, before she turned back to her phone. The flight attendants moved down the aisle, ensuring everything was in order. When the soldier sat down, the woman twisted slightly in her seat and muttered just loud enough for those around her to hear, "You'd think they'd put people like that somewhere else. Uniform or not, it doesn't mean much these days." The air grew tense. Passengers exchanged uneasy glances, unsure how to react. The soldier, seemingly oblivious, busied himself adjusting his seatbelt. But her comment hung in the air like an awkward silence no one wanted to address. The woman's casual cruelty felt oddly misplaced. Why target someone who had done nothing wrong? And yet, no one said a word. The plane took off, the tension lingering like an invisible storm cloud. But the quiet discomfort of the cabin was only the beginning of what would become a flight no one would forget. As the plane leveled out and the seatbelt sign dinged off, the woman's attitude seemed to intensify. She shifted in her seat, glancing back toward the soldier more than once, her disapproval as clear as the midday sun. She whispered to the passenger beside her, an older man in a Hawaiian shirt who seemed caught between politeness and discomfort. "It's just strange, isn't it? A soldier, on a flight like this? I mean, don't they usually fly on their own planes or something?" The man gave her a non-committal shrug, clearly eager to steer clear of the conversation. But she wasn't finished. "I mean, really, these days, anyone can wear a uniform. It doesn't mean they're any kind of hero." Her words carried further than she realized. Or maybe she knew exactly what she was doing. A woman sitting across the aisle glanced up from her book, her brow furrowed. A young couple 2 rows ahead exchanged a look, clearly uncomfortable. The soldier remained silent, his focus on the notebook in his lap. He was jotting something down. Perhaps a letter, perhaps notes. But whatever it was, it held his full attention. He didn't flinch at her words, didn't even glance in her direction. His calmness seemed to irritate her more. She pressed the call button for the flight attendant, a chipper young woman named Elena who arrived quickly. "Yes, ma'am? How can I help you?" "I'd like to move seats," the woman said, tilting her head toward the soldier. I'd prefer to sit somewhere else, somewhere quieter." Elena blinked, her professionalism masking her surprise. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but we're fully booked. There aren't any other seats available." The woman sighed dramatically and waved her hand as if dismissing the problem. "Fine, I'll manage." The passengers around her were visibly uncomfortable now. A man in his 30s leaned over to whisper to his wife, "What's her problem?" But no one spoke up. The unspoken rules of polite society held them all captive. Despite the growing tension, the soldier remained a picture of calm. He continued writing, occasionally pausing to look out the window. Whatever he was working on seemed far more important than the petty comments thrown his way. But his silence only emboldened the woman. As the drink service began, she made another passive-aggressive remark to Eleanor, loud enough for others to hear. "I guess standards must have changed. Can't imagine my father sitting next to someone like that back in his day." Eleanor froze for a split second before recovering. "Would you like coffee or tea, ma'am?" "Black coffee. No cream, no sugar," the woman replied curtly, clearly irritated that her comment didn't provoke a reaction. The soldier ordered water and smiled warmly at Eleanor. "Thank you," he said softly, his voice steady and kind. Eleanor smiled back, clearly relieved to have a pleasant interaction after the tense exchange. As the flight wore on, the woman continued her barely veiled commentary, each remark sharper than the last. She complained about the service, the seating, even the air conditioning. Every complaint felt like a thinly disguised jab at the soldier. But while the passengers grew increasingly uncomfortable, none of them could have predicted how quickly the mood would shift and how deeply it would affect them all. Through it all, the soldier remained unshaken. He sat quietly, his broad shoulders relaxed, his gaze focused on the notebook in his lap. The corners of his mouth twitched slightly every now and then. Not quite a smile, but a hint of something thoughtful, perhaps even wistful. It was clear he had learned long ago how to weather such storms without letting them break him. The soldier was young, probably in his late 20s, with a strong jawline and sharp, determined eyes. His uniform bore signs of wear, a frayed thread here, a faint scuff there, but it was immaculate otherwise, as if it meant something to him beyond mere duty. To him, it wasn't just fabric. It was a testament to something bigger. At one point, a small child seated in the row in front of him turned around and stared. The little boy couldn't have been more than 5, his chubby hands gripping the edge of the seat. "Are you a real soldier?" he asked, his voice full of wonder. The soldier looked up, his expression softening. "I am," he replied with a gentle smile. The boy's mother, seated beside him, quickly apologized. "I'm so sorry. He's just curious." "It's no trouble," the soldier said, his tone warm and reassuring. "It's always good to ask questions." The boy grinned, clearly in awe. "Do you fight bad guys?" The soldier hesitated, his smile faltering for the briefest moment. "Sometimes I help keep people safe," he said carefully, his voice tinged with a kind of quiet humility that spoke volumes. The exchange was short, but it didn't go unnoticed. A few passengers who had been casting curious glances at him now seemed to see him in a new light. Still, the woman in the tailored blazer remained unmoved. She rolled her eyes and muttered something under her breath about playing hero. The soldier didn't react. He returned to his notebook, writing with measured strokes. A few rows back, Elena, the flight attendant, whispered to a colleague, "He's got more patience than anyone I've ever seen." And she was right. It wasn't that he didn't hear the woman's comments, he just refused to engage. Maybe it was because he'd heard them before. Maybe it was because he knew there were battles worth fighting, and this wasn't one of them. Or maybe it was because he was carrying something far heavier than her words could ever be. As the flight neared its destination, the soldier carefully folded the notebook and tucked it into his bag. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box, cradling it in his hand as though it were made of glass. For a moment his expression changed. The calm facade wavered, replaced by something deeper, grief perhaps, or reverence. The box wasn't flashy, but it held significance. Those seated nearby noticed, but didn't dare ask. There was an unspoken understanding that whatever it wasn't their place to pry. The soldier closed his eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath. When he opened them again, the calmness had returned, as though he'd drawn strength from whatever memory the box held. But the significance of that moment wouldn't fully hit anyone, not even the woman, until the next day, when the headlines revealed what the soldier had been carrying and why it mattered so deeply. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the windows of a suburban home in Scottsdale, Arizona. The woman from the flight sat at her dining table, a steaming cup of coffee in her hand. She scrolled absent-mindedly through her phone, catching up on emails and social media. The flight from Dallas had been uneventful in her mind, just another trip. She had moved on, oblivious to the discomfort she'd caused. Her morning routine was a predictable one. Coffee, a quick scan of the news, and then a few calls before heading to her mid-morning meeting. Today, however, the news caught her attention in a way that was anything but routine. A headline stood out, bold and unmissable. Local soldier returns home from final mission, carrying fallen comrade's ashes. She paused, her thumb hovering over the screen. Something about the photo beneath the headline tugged at her memory. She clicked the link, and as the page loaded, her breath hitched. There he was, the soldier from the plane. His face was unmistakable, his calm eyes staring back at her from the screen. The article detailed his journey. Staff Sergeant Elijah Brooks, returning home after a grueling tour overseas. He had been accompanying the remains of his best friend and fellow soldier, Sergeant Adam Reyes, who had fallen in the line of duty. The velvet box she had seen him holding during the flight. It contained Reyes's dog tags, a cherished keepsake for the grieving family. As the woman read on, the details became harder to bear. Elijah and Adam had been childhood friends, inseparable since grade school in El Paso, Texas. They had joined the army together, promising to look out for each other no matter what. That promise had been put to the ultimate test during their final mission, a rescue operation gone wrong. Adam had shielded Elijah from an explosion, sacrificing his own life in the process. Elijah had been the one to recover Adam's body and ensure he made it home to his family. The words blurred as the woman's eyes welled with tears. Her mind raced back to the flight, to every snide remark she had made. She remembered how calm he had been, how he hadn't said a word in his defense. Now, she understood why. He wasn't ignoring her out of indifference. He was carrying a grief so profound that her petty comments couldn't touch it. She set her phone down and stared at her coffee, her appetite gone. Guilt surged through her, heavy and suffocating. She had judged him without knowing anything about him, reduced him to a stereotype in her mind. And yet, he had shown her nothing but quiet dignity. The article concluded with a quote from Elijah. "Adam was more than my best friend. He was my brother. Bringing him home was the last thing I could do for him, and I'll carry his memory with me for the rest of my life." The woman's chest tightened. She thought of her own brother, who had passed away years ago in a car accident. She remembered the pain, the emptiness, and how even the smallest gesture of kindness had meant the world during those dark days. How could she, of all people, have been so cruel to someone in mourning? Her thoughts spiraled. What if someone else on the flight had stepped in? What if she had chosen to keep her thoughts to herself? The weight of her actions pressed down on her, and for the first time in years, she felt truly ashamed. But as she stared out the window, the morning light casting long shadows across the room, she realized that guilt alone wasn't enough. She had to do something, anything, to make this right. The woman sat in silence, the hum of her phone notifications ignored as she replayed every moment of the flight in her mind. Each word she had spoken to the soldier now felt like a shard of glass lodged in her chest. The calm way he had carried himself, the quiet dignity in his every action, it all stood in stark contrast to her own behavior. She glanced back at the article on her phone, her fingers trembling as she scrolled through it again. The image of Elijah, standing at attention in full uniform beside a flag-draped casket, burned into her mind. His expression was solemn, resolute. But there was a sorrow in his eyes that no words could capture. The woman couldn't hold back the tears any longer. They came fast and unrelenting, her breaths hitching as guilt and shame overwhelmed her. She thought about the stories she had heard from her own father, a World War II veteran, about the bonds soldiers shared, how they would sacrifice everything for one another. And here she was, decades later, belittling a man who had carried his brother in arms home, likely at great personal cost. Her mind drifted to her brother again, the pain of his loss, a wound that never fully healed. She remembered how she had once lashed out at a stranger during the early days of her grief, an innocent store clerk who hadn't deserved her misplaced anger. It was a moment she had carried with her for years, a reminder of how easily pain could turn into cruelty. And yet, she had done it again, this time to someone who had already endured so much. She thought of the soldier's silence during the flight, how he had refused to respond to her barbs. It wasn't because he was weak, she realized. It was because he was strong. Stronger than she had ever been. He had chosen to rise above her words, to focus on what truly mattered, and in doing so, he had shown her a quiet grace she hadn't deserved. The thought of apologizing crossed her mind, but how? She didn't even know his name until now. Tracking him down felt intrusive, and what could she possibly say that would make up for her actions? The weight of her regret was paralyzing, yet she knew she couldn't let it end there. She spent the rest of the morning researching. By the afternoon, she had learned more about Elijah's story and the charity he had set up in his friend Adam's honor, a fund to support the families of fallen soldiers. Her heart ached as she read about the struggles these families faced, about the lives forever changed by sacrifice. The next day, she made a donation to the fund, her hands trembling as she typed out her message. She kept it short but sincere. To Staff Sergeant Elijah Brooks. I didn't know your story, but now I do. Thank you for your service and for showing me the meaning of true strength. I'm sorry for the words I said, and I'll carry this lesson with me for the rest of my life. Hitting send felt like a small step in a much longer journey. She knew she couldn't erase what had happened, but she could choose to be better. She could choose to honor his sacrifices, and those of so many others, by carrying forward a lesson in kindness and humility. Later that evening, she sat outside on her patio, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The guilt was still there, but it was accompanied by something new: resolve. She had seen the worst in herself, and now she wanted to do better, not just for Elijah, but for everyone she might encounter in the future. Because in the end, the weight of her actions wasn't just about the soldier or even about herself. It was about the kind of world she wanted to help create. The woman's days after the flight were no longer routine. Each time she opened her phone or sat with her morning coffee, she thought about Staff Sergeant Elijah Brooks and what his story had taught her. His strength wasn't in the uniform or the medals he had earned, but in his unwavering grace in the face of ignorance. He had shown her that sometimes the strongest response is silence, and sometimes silence speaks louder than words. She carried that lesson into her interactions with others. At work, she made an effort to truly listen to her colleagues, to offer kindness instead of criticism. In her personal life, she reached out to friends and family she had drifted away from, apologizing for moments when she hadn't been her best self. Slowly, she began to feel lighter, the burden of guilt transforming into a determination to do better. The story of Elijah and Adam stayed with her, not as a memory of her shame, but as a reminder of the sacrifices others make and the importance of empathy. She found herself telling the story to others, not the part about her own behavior, but about two soldiers and their unbreakable bond. Each time, she ended with a simple message. We never know the battles others are fighting, so let's choose kindness. As for Elijah, he never responded to her message, and she didn't expect him to. Her apology wasn't about seeking forgiveness. It was about acknowledging the wrong and learning from it. She hoped, in some small way, her donation helped others like him and Adam. Life moved on, but it moved differently. The woman who once judged so easily now sought to understand. She knew she couldn't rewrite the past, but she could shape the future, her future, with compassion, humility, and respect. Because in the end, it isn't about the words we say in haste, but the actions we take after. So, if this story touched you, remember, every interaction is a choice. Let's choose to make it one we'll be proud of. If this story resonates with you, hit that subscribe button and share this message of empathy and kindness. Let's spread it far and wide. Thank you for watching.